And now I will read a story, the big story from the magazine, which is called "I Was a Patsy for a Beatle Haircut." The year was 1963, and I, Lee Harvey Osmond, stepped out of a barbershop in Dallas, Texas, with a freshly waxed pompadour, duck-tailed and pie-eyed with just a hint of a 5 o'clock shadow, both loving and hating the world at the same time, and with an abhorrence of everything lavish, gaudy, and tacky, which lacks taste and flavor in ways of tacky tastelessness, which could leave a bad taste in your mouth like stale, unleavened bread and a smelly mouthful of stinky sweat socks. And little did I know at the time, because it was unbeknownst to me, myself and I, that my life would change, that my life would never be the same again or later, and would change not for the betterment of mankind, but for the worserment of mine. You see, the reason I, Lee Harvey Osmond, had just gotten myself pumped, ducked, pied, and fived on that fateful day was because I was on my way to the 25th annual Bar Mitzvah and Southern Baptist Poorhouse Management Convention, at which I would be acting as the acting master of ceremonies. The only goy to have ever done so, I might add, mainly because of house rules laid out during the Civil War, namely that no Jewish pimp convention may be held on the premises unless it is emceed by a non-Jewish Texan who happens to be a relative of the owner, of whom I Lee Harvey Osmond, was the 35th cousin on his mother's side twice removed. As I got into the taxi after pulling the 2 nice blue-haired old ladies that the cabbie just picked up out and throwing them and most of their luggage after them on the sidewalk, I thought of all those 13-year-old bar mitzvah boys who were about to step into manhood and the manly Jew scene with their brand new shined up and shiny pink shoes. And I had to admit I was nervous. It would be the first time I'd ever mastered of ceremony a convention of hyper-hormone teenage Hebrews. But it was rumored that they could be ruthless, except for those of them with either mothers or sisters named Ruth. I got there 5 minutes late and found the ceremony was half over. One of the bar mitzvah boys was on stage chanting some passages he'd memorized from the Torah after he'd finished and dived headlong into the empty mosh pit. I asked the rabbi if he could translate for me from the Jewese what the little Jew boy had been babbling. The rabbi blew an enormous bubble of Bazooka Jew bubblegum, which popped and stuck all over his beard, and without bothering to clean it off, he proceeded to answer me in a chanting voice. Oh, raise the rent on all the local whorehouses in your local locality, as well as the surrounding areas that happen to be nearby. He went on to explain to me how hard these soon-to-be young mensch pimps had been working in their ascent to bar mitzvahhood and bar mitzvahship by learning by heart and also memorizing entire passages of and sometimes complete sentences from the Torah, as well as putting their lessons into practice by managing small whorehouses in run-down neighborhoods of the city, using the cooks, maids, and Avon ladies already in their parents' employ. They had tried their damnedest and their darndest to make these little establishments the best little whorehouses in Texas, Dallas, and the surrounding states of Houston and Hoboken. And damn it, they are, said the rabbi. That was due, I knew, to the many frequent and often recurring visitations to those said pimp-run bordellos by none other than John the Big F. Kennedy and his entire Kennedy clan, which was properly known as the Kennedys. It was well known and even popular common knowledge that even though John the Big F. Kennedy was descended from and even related to Irish Roman Catholics from Ireland, he happened to be very hip to the Jew scene, especially money-wise, for economical reasons, even though he wasn't circumcised, at least not very much. After the ceremonies that I was the master of, but hadn't mastered yet, were over, I was allowed to get up and on stage and master the end of them by saying, "Thank you all for coming." The rabbi was so impressed by my performance that he invited me to join them all to the Holocaust survivors picnic and singles dance, which would be taking place that afternoon in a nearby Jewish cemetery across the street but 2 states away. The only condition being that I go incognito and wear the fake nose and glasses he handed me so no one would know I am not Jewish. Where I would meet the Mormon Klezmer Jew Lounge act of Donny Auschwitz and Marie Magdalene, who performed at all the most swinging galas and who were on everyone's cocktail party A-list. Not only did I, Lee Harvey Osmond, get a free ride in the limousine, although not in the usual customary trunk, but in the back seat with the rabbi who was sharing a bottle of Manischewitz tequila with me that he had a pickled gefilte worm at the bottom. But I was also as a bonus and a plus by accident converted to Judaism. What happened was that while the limo was bumping and bouncing for several miles over the rocky back roads, taking a shortcut to get across the street to the cemetery, the good rabbi was in the process of slicing lemons to marinate the worm with, and using a very sharp circumcision knife to do so while drunk out of his mind. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the driver was also drunk, though not on kosher tequila as we were, which may have been the problem. But anyway, he swerved off the road and hit a tree and an old man and a Newfoundland dog on a leash. I think it was an oak tree. And when he hit it, it caused the rabbi to lurch sideways to accidentally, but very skillfully, cut off my foreskin. The rabbi was so extremely remorseful and even ashamed of himself for his skillful surgical clumsiness that he even felt guilty on top of that, so much so in the fact that he decided to make it up to me on the spot by making me a Jew, so it would be all right not to have a foreskin. And even said I could take off the fake nose and glasses because since I, Lee Harvey Osmond, was Jewish now, I didn't need to pretend I was Jewish anymore. Other than the fact that I was in a lot of pain and in the vicinity of my genitalia and nearly bleeding to death, things couldn't have gone better for me if I'd planned them myself. You see, I was not in reality a licensed master of ceremonies. I, Lee Harvey Osmond, was in fact an enforcer working undercover for an organization known as Seasons Beatings Incorporated. And even though I was soon to meet the great Donny Auschwitz, I couldn't within the confines of my profession beat him to death, beat him to death, or even within an inch of his life, because Mormons were out of season. I would have to wait till Christmas for that. Besides, all that beating up Mormons was the least of my worries. What I was worried about was when I would be able to beat my wife up again, which was what I normally did every Saturday, because I was only home on Saturday. But now that I was Jewish, I couldn't beat up my wife on Saturday anymore, because the rabbi told me that it's against Jew law to beat your wife up on a Saturday. And I guess that meant my wife too. So the question was, how was I going to keep in practice on my days off? Beating people up is my way of life. It's in my blood as much as it is in the blood of the people I beat up to be beaten up by me. And their blood is often on my fists. I first knew it was my true calling when I did my first job well done, which was done well for the brothers Cain and Abel Pimp Schlumperdinck. Cain Schlumperdinck had hired me to beat the crap out of his brother Abel Pimp Schlumperdinck. But as a twist of fate would happen, Abel Pimp had already beforehand previously hired me to lay the boots to his brother Cain. So in such a case, what's a poor enforcer to do? Turn hoodlum and run with the money? That's what. So that's what I Lee Harvey Osmond did. While Kane and Abel Pimp Schlumperdinck, who were doing quite well for themselves, thank you very much, in a sold-out show at Vinny's Boom 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 in Lake Tahoe in Las Vegas, Nevada, where they were paying off a debt that they owed to society. The comedy team of John Wayne and Schuster Newtonstein, not to mention the Rat Pack, which includes Frank Sinatra Jr., Sammy Davis Jr., Dino Martin-Blatz Jr., plus Peter Lawford, who was married to Estelle Getty Kennedy, whom he had a tendency to call Poopsie Poop for short, because he was always sauced out on the martinis that she called Drinky Poos, and served him at night as nightcaps before Lights Out in Sleepsville, which is in the suburbs of Twinkle Toes, Tinseltown. No, I, Lee Harvey Osmond, was there to fulfill a contract. Alexei Kachakakov, the Russian from Russia, whose father, Yakov Kachakakov, by the way, was the famous and well-known inventor of the Kachakakov birth control method that was then widely in use in the suburbs of Siberia and other neighboring towns where nobody lived. Well, Alexei was rushing around in a hurry and making haste to find his way back to Red Square by way of John F. Kennedy Airport, which hadn't been invented yet, by the way of the Red Eye inside of the first Spruce Goose back to Mother Russia, where Big Brother was watching like a Big Brother should. Although the aforesaid, yet to be invented John F. Kennedy airstrip had yet to be invented yet, that John F. Kennedy strip joint had been invented, and I had a runway too, and it was in the hollow beer-stained halls of that smelly jingle joint that he met in the coat check room and perhaps fell in love with, or maybe only developed, an intensely mild case of brutal infatuation with Marilyn Monroe. But that was many years ago, and now Alexei was at the Holocaust survivors picnic and singles dance, trying to schmooze with the Jews, even though schmoozing hadn't been invented yet, and to sell them on investing in America's franchise of shops that sold his father's clean, safe, and final method of birth control to the American masses and general population. The Kachakakov birth control method, which he believed would be a particular interest to the Jews, because he told them it would take circumcision to a new and even shorter lengths, all the way to the new millennium and even into the next century. He was in the process of demonstrating the techniques on himself for the gathered multitudes of Jews when he looked up and saw me, Lee Harvey Osmond, coming. He knew I was after him, because the KGB had a file on me back in the Kremlin hardware store and Borscht Belt Palace, which included a baby picture that still looks like me, which he recognized, and ran all the while dragging behind him the famous Kachakakov birth control device. He ran out of the cemetery with me charging after him and ducked into the darkness of the John F. Kennedy strip joint. I busted in after him and found the place packed to the gills and fins because an unknown and extremely popular band that nobody liked was playing on the stage while the strippers danced. They called themselves Pete Best, Illich Lenin, and the Beatles. I could see Kachakakov from the back running towards the stage. The three singers had their three pompadoured heads together in front of one microphone as they sang in four-part harmony and harmonous rendition of a melody of national anthems of Central America, banana republics. When Kachakakov came up on stage, quickly placed the birth control device over their heads and used it to remove all the hair on their heads until they didn't have any left and were even bald as a result. Then he grabbed the aforementioned greasy pompadoured scalps and ran backstage. His intentions had been, I found out later, to make a wig with which to disguise himself so that I wouldn't recognize him when I saw him or even knew who he was. But these are the events I afterwards placed together from the pieces of events I found in pieces of afterwards. While Alexei Kachakakov was hurrying backstage, he accidentally tripped over Marilyn Monroe, who was in the process of dyeing her hair blonde backstage by dipping her head into a big bathtub full of Mr. Bubble Bath peroxide, which caused him to drop the would-be Beatle wig into the peroxide, which dyed it blonde, straightened it, washed it off the pomp grease, and when he finished fished it out, he was also discovered that they had all fused into one big blonde Beatle wig, which he promptly put on. As he looked in the mirror, he decided that a blonde Beatle wig did not mesh with his skin tone.
He looked around and noticed that as he had run off stage, dragging the Kutchikokoff birth control and now scalping device behind him, he must have inadvertently cut off the foot of the drummer of the band, because the aforementioned Beatle boot with Pete Best's best foot inside of it was lying there next to Marilyn, who was unconscious on the floor. Alexei suddenly got an idea. He picked up the Beatle boot, which was thickly coated with black Beatle boot polish, shook the best foot out of it, and proceeded to blacken the wig with great handfuls of the goo. At that point, the Beatles came charging backstage, except of course for Pete Best, whose best foot was already backstage, so he hopped. And when they saw Alexei standing there with their hair on, they stopped and stood dumbfounded and a little surprised. Alexei Kutchikokoff had just given them an idea that would make them soon famous. Little did he know at the time that he had just invented what would in just a couple of years be known as the Beatle haircut. Retrieving Pete Best's best foot, the Beatles went back on stage, leaving Alexei to finish blackening the wig and finally his face, so that he not only looked like Al Jolson, but was a dead ringer for Ringo, whoever he was or would be. Meanwhile, I, Lee Harvey Osmond, had snuck around the back, hoping to get the jump on Alexei, when a man who looked like Alexei's mother, wearing a Beatle haircut which had just been invented, though I didn't know that, but which looked something like a Jackie the Big B Kennedy hairstyle, come running out and headed towards the grassy knoll across the street. Figuring that Alexei's mother might know where he was, I decided to follow close in pursuit behind her. There was at that moment a presidential motorcade moving down the street, mostly on wheels, which coincidentally contained a car that was carrying John the Big F. Kennedy, the President of the United States of America, as well as right there in the back seat beside him, Jackie the Big O. Kennedy, the President of his money. Now, Alexei had plenty of reason to have a grudge against the Big F, since they both had been rivals for the affections of Marilyn Monroe, who was at that moment being fed an overdose of birth control pills, heroin, and peroxide by a psychiatrist on the presidential payroll, Dr. Sigmund James Joyce Brothers, who had been hiding all this time backstage until Alexei ran out. It was a well-known fact that many people who didn't know anything about it, that John the Big F. Kennedy had never really wanted to be the president and had only been forced into it by his Irish Mafia Don Dad Joe, who would have forced his younger son Bobby to be president if he hadn't made him mad by spelling mafia all the time with 2 F's. What John really wanted to be was a hitman for the Italian mob, but here he was instead, drunk out of his mind on Irish whiskey and distractedly receiving a blowjob from Jackie in the back seat of the convertible, when a shot rang out like something out of a gun that had been fired and hit him like a bullet in the head, though not the head that Jackie was giving him at the time. Fortunately for her, her head was bobbing far below the trajectory of the bullet, and it saved her from being shot like an assassination victim in the night, even though it was early afternoon. No one knew for certain or for sure or even for instance where the bullet came from, other than the fact that it probably came from a gun just a second before the Big F hit the big one. But some people were shouting that they'd seen a man with a Beatle haircut, which had only just been invented, though they didn't know that, and neither did I, though I didn't know it twice as much as anybody else because I was already unfamiliar with it, brandishing it in a threatening manner, a device which they thought might have been either a gun or some kind of kitchen appliance used for birth control. I, Lee Harvey Osmond, was closing in on Kutchikokoff and ready to give a serious legal in-season beating on him when he suddenly tore off his Beatle wig, and with an unerring aim, mostly because of him having been a gold medal winning Olympic wig thrower for 3 consecutive Saturdays at the Summer Olympics for the Russian team, proceeded to toss the wig, which he had deviously superglued with a type of glue that hadn't been invented yet called superglue, onto my head. I, Lee Harvey Osmond, was then placed immediately under arrest for the murder, assassination, and killing of John the Big F. Kennedy, and I knew right then and there that I was a patsy for a Beatle haircut. The key witnesses in what came to be known throughout history thenceforth or shortly after that were the evil twin brothers of the Righteous Brothers, who were known as the Wrongtious Brothers by all their evil fans, who were many, legion, multitudinous, varied, and not just a few, though consisting of nobody important other than the man who shot me on the way to court, namely Jack the Jew, Juby, who happened to be as Jewish as the next Joe, though maybe a little more than me, and who just happened to be a son of a gun of a hitman for the kosher nostrum. So now I, Lee Harvey Osmond, am dead. It's not much of a life to be dead because I can't beat people up anymore, and I just thought I'd tell my story because there's nothing else to do, and when there's nothing else to do, Cad's Jizz magazine is the place to do it. At least that's what they say sometimes, I guess. All of these events detailed in this story happen to be 100% true, but the names have been changed to protect the liars who told it, who are as follows: Cad Gold Jr, Surreal Sr, and the Right Honourable Minkenstein Buzzweezliac Jr, the second and a half.